welcome back. I hope lunch was light, so you're full of energy to hear our keynote speaker, who is Hamza Walker. Hamza is the director of Laxart, a non-profit art space in Los Angeles. Prior to joining Laxart, Hamza was, he joined in 2016, sorry. Prior to joining Laxart, he was Director of Education and Associate Curator at the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago, a non-collecting contemporary art museum. Laxart has a number of exhibitions. The last one was in 2022, Nikita Gale's Takers, and Hamza is curating an exhibition entitled Monuments, and this talk is inspired by it, which will be at the Geffen Contemporary at MoCA in the fall of 2025. Welcome, Hamza.
All right, clicker in hand. Yeah, thank you for the invitation to come and speak. This is quite to be put in the context of public art is great. I served as a public art coordinator for the city of Chicago for 5 years. So I was just speaking with Oscar about all the questions I didn't ask during that first panel. I could have acted up. But now that we're all fat and happy and caffeinated, let's do this. All right. So, Monuments, title of an exhibition, all in caps. A project I've been working on since 2017. It's collaboration between LAX Art and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, and it's slated to open October of 2025, so a little more than a year from now. And this slide shows a selection of monuments that we will be borrowing from different municipalities from throughout the United States as part of the exhibition. So the exhibition has a very simple conceit. It is 15 monuments, stone, bronze, shown alongside works of contemporary art. And the works of contemporary art fall into two categories: commissions and existing work. So I'll just talk about it. So co-organized by these two organizations. There's the curatorial team, myself, Chiara Walker, and Bennett. He's the inside man at MoCA. And Chiara was an obvious choice given the nature of her work and the theme. So I should clarify, in terms of the monuments that we're borrowing, they are ones that have come down since 2017, and the core of those monuments are decommissioned Confederate monuments. But there are several of them are not Confederate monuments, and so we've taken to calling the show Confederates and Friends. Okay, so here's the Geffen. The Geffen is a 40,000 square foot industrial space in downtown Los Angeles that's capable of mounting the show. So in terms of thinking where to do this, this is an obvious place to do it. But more importantly, as far as the kind of sub-basements to the exhibition, the words contextualization, decontextualization, recontextualization have come up earlier. Really, really important to decontextualize the monuments, by which I mean, when I first mentioned the idea, a couple people came forward and said, hey, this idea sounds great. Are you looking for a place to do the show? Meaning, this one cat, Kevin Burke, he's a downtown developer. He said, hey, man, I own a lot around Staples Center downtown, so if you want to use it, just let me know. And I said, no, it's important that they not be outdoors, right? That's already too close to where their native habitat. So the idea of having them shown indoors, not on their pedestals, was, I think, key as a move of decontextualization, let alone showing them in a museum of contemporary art, because we want to hold these things accountable to the present. That's very, very important. So one of the real basic reasons for mounting the exhibition, in some sense, we're still arguing about the Civil War in the United States, right? Still equivocating as to what the real cause of the Civil War is. It was slavery, full stop. Now that gets to, and these are two examples, right, of arguments that wage on, left and right. Here's a publication by Samuel Mitchum, and the other's an online article. Right. But it's really about the lost cause. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the lost cause, that is the portrayal of the Confederacy as a noble victim, right? That they fought for ideals that transcended slavery. And the code word for that usually is, it was about states' rights, right? Well, a state's right to do what, right, as the real issue. Just a piece of American history. 1835, the nullification crisis, right? That was a group of states had threatened to secede over the issue of tariffs. This was led by South Carolina, notably John C. Calhoun, when these states felt that the government was taxing southern states unfairly. And then when it came time to actually draft notes of secession from the Union, one by one, the 5 other states that said that they would secede, along with South Carolina, all slowly declined, leaving South Carolina as the lone state willing to secede from the Union over the issue of tariffs, right? Now, you mentioned slavery, everybody's like, oh shit, we're all in, we're ready to secede, right? So just to give an example, it's like a state's right to do what? Tariffs, taxation, no. Slavery, yes, we will do it. So that's what's important. It's just one example, right? So that's the story of how the losers became heroes, in a way, right? We fought nobly for states' rights, what we really believed in, right? So just some more backdrop, right? So there are there were over 800 Confederate statues. This is a map showing their location. Of that 800, 200 of them have since come down, right? Just over 200 of them since 2017, okay? And I had a number of question slides. This one just got, someone didn't remove it. But one of the big questions, what's the relationship between present-day grievances and historical injustices, right? Which I think is a real, I can't even call it a subtext for the exhibition. So now some background for the exhibition. Those of you who don't know, this is the Mother Emanuel Baptist Church in Charleston, South Carolina. This was the site of the massacre in 2015. Dylan Roof goes into the church, murders 9. He's an avowed white supremacist, neo-Confederate. He's not from South Carolina. He chose Mother Emanuel Church because he knew its historical significance. Mother Emanuel Church is one of 2 churches where the African Methodist Episcopal Church was founded, right? He knew that. And it was also the site where Denmark Vesey and what would have been one of the biggest slave revolts in the country was apparently planned, but ultimately foiled, right? Dylan Roof knew this, so just to give a degree of intentionality behind the massacre, right? So these are the 9 congregants that were killed. Immediately afterwards, Bree Newsom, 10 days after the shooting, she goes to the state capitol, Columbia, South Carolina, goes up, takes down the Confederate flag. That's the first call for the removal of signs and symbols of the Confederacy. Right. 2 years later, Mitch Landrieu, mayor of New Orleans, there was, ever-present political pressure from below, grassroots, calling for their removal. But it was really with the Mother Emanuel massacre that Mitch Landrieu began to push for legislation within the city council to have the statues in New Orleans taken down. Now, the statues in New Orleans are big ones. Those aren't your cookie-cutter variety. These are major commissions of Confederate figures. So New Orleans was the first to fall, essentially, right? 4 of them came down, right? Concurrently, Charlottesville was going to take its Confederate statues down. New Orleans, they were both pushing for legislation through their city councils at the same time. New Orleans got it done first, giving the far right time to organize against the removal in Charlottesville, and that was the Unite the Right rally in August of 2017, where groups of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, rallied around the Robert E. Lee sculpture in the center of Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally. Then there were the counter-protests against the Unite the Right rally. So this all happened very, very quickly, right? This was within like a 2-week span after the Unite the Right rally. A number of cities, mayors, took them down out of fear that either the counter-protesters would yank them down or that they would be a rallying point for neo-Confederates and fascists. So all in all, 2017 to 2019, 40 monuments came down in that period. So that was the spark for the show was the Unite the Right rally. So I started working on it right after 2017. That's when Trump gave the talk, and he proclaimed that there were good people on both sides, essentially, right? So then, fast forward, 2020, killing George Floyd. That's when the Black Lives Matter movement, which had been following its own trajectory and path in terms of activism with respect to high-profile incidents and police shootings, and the monuments issue merged. So right after the summer, right after George Floyd's murder, an additional 150 monuments came down. So now there are over 200 monuments total that have come down. So we've been planning the show at the same time that the second wave of removals happened. Right? And that includes Richmond, Virginia. So even though only 200 out of the 800 have come down, I would make an argument that it is important which 200 have come down. So a lot of them are just kind of standard cookie cutter, you know, essentially you could have ordered these Confederate monuments from basically what amounts to a Sears and Roebuck's catalog, right? Soldier at the rest, soldier at the ready, right? Something like Richmond, Monument Avenue, those like New Orleans, those were huge, major statements as far as, you know, commissions go, right? So to have them come down, I think, is key. Within that 200 that have come down, those are some of the biggest ones. All right, so these are some of the ones that we're borrowing. This is where they're coming from. Upwards, Boston, Pittsburgh, Houston, Charlottesville, Richmond is in there somewhere. Here are the towns: Elberton, Georgia, Lynchburg, Baltimore. All right, so 4 from Baltimore. On your left, this double equestrian, Lee Jackson, which is one of the biggest monuments we'll be borrowing. And this is a monument to the soldiers and sailors of the Confederacy. And it's important to note, when I would first mention the idea of the exhibition, people thought, oh my God, you're going to take these things and simply like put them back up? Like, why are you doing that? And I obviously, they aren't seeing what I'm seeing. Roughly half of these monuments have been paint bombed or damaged. And so when you see them, they're no longer, you know, they're as much, they reflect the protests of 2019, 2020, as much as they serve as, you know, historical artifacts or objects or artworks. So we'll be showing the Soldier and Sailors Monument like this, paint bombed. Right, so here are the other two. This is a monument to the women of the Confederacy. Note the art historical motif, the Pietà. I'll get back to that in a second. And its allegorical significance, right? To have the Pietà with the suggestion that, you know, like Christ, the South will rise again. On the left, Rajatani. he was a Supreme Court justice responsible for the Dred Scott decision, which was basically the precursor, the dismantling of the Missouri Compromise. It laid the groundwork for the Civil War. It further defined people as property as well. So here they are. So a lot of these monuments, when they were taken down, were stored on the fringes of these cities. Notably, it's the same pattern. They store them out where they keep the snow plows, trucks, salt mounds, darkness on the edge of town. Boston, the Emancipation Group. There are two versions of this. One version is in DC. This is the one in Boston. The one in Boston is in, this one came down. This is the only monument, 1879, to acknowledge the freeing of the slaves in terms of at that time, right, within the wake of the Civil War. It was paid for by freed slaves. They did not have a say in the artist or let alone the composition of the piece. It was, Frederick Douglass actually spoke at the inauguration of the one in DC. And even though he spoke at its dedication, he really harbored a resentment about it. One, obviously, Lincoln as, white savior, right? Freedom is yours to give as a problem, right? It obfuscates blacks' attempts at self-emancipation, as one of the problems that he would have with it. But again, like I said, there are two, one in DC, one in Boston. I'm of the mindset in terms of taking this one down, it's like, wait, no. One, this is a marker, the only one within a particular time period in the wake of the Civil War to acknowledge the freeing of the slaves. Two, it was paid for by freed slaves, and I wouldn't want to lose sight of this. So when people talk about, reasons for them staying or coming down, this one was taken down because of the depiction of the kneeling slave. Right? So this was considered a demeaning representation of an African American, which is the reason for it coming down. But if I were to weigh that against the history of the piece, I would tend to fall on the side of keeping it up for all of its problems, in a way. Right? But again, there are two. So this one was paid for by a wealthy patron in Boston who saw the one in DC and approached Thomas Ball, who lived in Boston, is a native of Boston, to do the same piece, except in bronze, in DC. This is coming from New Orleans. This is the only obelisk that we have in the show. This is the Battle of Liberty Place Monument, 1891. It's the only monument to have inscribed on it that it is indeed a monument to white supremacy in the text. The Battle of Liberty Place, it was kind of paradigmatic of a number of skirmishes to take place in the wake of the Civil War. A group called the White League overthrew the Louisiana state government during Reconstruction, 1874. The federal government came in and said, no, you reinstate the Louisiana government right now, which they did. But then 2 years later, the elections came, and that government was voted out of office, so the White League felt vindicated, essentially, right? So they made a monument to the battle, and that's what this text commemorates, right? So this is the last panel. The story that I just told goes around all four sides. This is the last panel of it. That photograph on the left, that text, even though this was put up in 1891, that text was added in 1932. The 1930s are when the Ku Klux Klan, that's when they had the greatest purchase on American political life. This photograph was actually taken by Dorothea Lange when she was working, the photographer known for her work in the Dust Bowl and in the South, right after this would have been unveiled, which I think is a very interesting note, right? That it caught her eye, right? So, oh yeah, this one actually, I think I have more slides of it. Its importance in the exhibition. can't be overstated. This is an earlier installation. Let's put up. That's the photograph by Dorothea Lange when that text was added, right? So this monument has gone up, it's gone down, it's gone back up, it's gone down, it's gone back up. So it's been moved around for different reasons. The text that stated that it's a monument to white supremacy was erased. It was covered over with this block of granite above that date. Then they added another text where the text in honor of those Americans that fought on both sides of the conflict. Sounds very much like what Trump said in 2017. In addition to its relocation, going down and going back up, it's been protested throughout its history. This is another view of the plaque that they added later. Right? And we'll show this as part of the exhibition, this broken latter-day plaque. Right? So in 1974, the student branch of the NAACP, they held a rally around it, right, calling for its removal. And this monument supports white supremacy, take it down. 1978, another rally, right? And now this is Kalamu Yaha Salam, spokesman for the Committee for Accountable Police, right? So, it should look familiar. 1978, right? 1985, this is a flyer that was distributed. That's Hitler's birthday. This was a flyer that was distributed calling for a rally around that monument for KKK white supremacists. Right? So they used that monument. So we were talking about the issue of the monuments with Mechtild's thing, right? It's use. Well, we can't take it down. It's still in use. Who's using it? What? How? For what? 1993. When I first saw this picture, I thought it was a Jeff Wall photograph. I was just like, you got to be kidding me. This can't. Those are like right out of the Matrix, these cops with the, you know. So Avery Alexander, state rep, in a chokehold, 1993, protesting. This is when David Duke got elected, right? So David Duke was a state rep in Louisiana who was a Ku Klux Klan member, right? And if you looked up the Ku Klux Klan's phone number, it was David Duke's phone number in the phone book, right? So it was just open. Right? 2004, right? Protesters putting graffiti on it. Now, here it is now. This is when it was taken away, dismantled. So this is the state that we'll show it in, right? Just dismantled, pretty much like this. This one coming from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is Stephen Foster, who's considered the father of American popular music. 1830s, string of hits. My Old Kentucky Home, Camptown Races, Oh Susanna, Old Black Joe. Here he's penning the song Uncle Ned, which is unsparing in its use of the N word. And he is sitting atop his muse, that is Uncle Ned, right? Like the Emancipation Group, this sculpture was taken down because of the demeaning representation of African Americans, right? This kind of Uncle Remus figure. Josephus Daniels. Josephus Daniels, late 19th century, he founds what's the biggest newspaper in North Carolina, out of Raleigh-Durham. And he was an avowed white supremacist, very much against blacks getting the right to vote. He used his newspaper as a platform to drum up sentiments that resulted in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. It's the only successful coup on American soil. The government, the state government of New Orleans, was overthrown by an angry mob of 2,000 white men. So Josephus Daniels, we're borrowing this from the Daniels family, which is quite interesting. Frank Daniels, who I was instrumental in taking it down. He said, no, we're going to move it to the standard. He will not be on a pedestal. And it was interesting. I'm going to do an interview with Frank Daniels. But he's also typical of Southern Democrats of the time. He was actually very much for women having the right to vote, for example. So to talk about him as a man in full. Street signs, right? So this is a shout out to Heather and Todd. Jefferson Davis, this is coming from Montgomery, Alabama. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis Avenue has been decommissioned. And we're we're not borrowing, it's quite funny, Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, Alabama has given us this pair of street signs. You have to realize Alabama, this is the South, this is the same landscape where the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement played itself out, right? So you've got these layers of history as literally played out in the naming of streets, right? If that's the case, you will get these intersections, right? They've since renamed Jefferson Davis Avenue Rosa Parks, not Rosa Parks, they've named it Fred Gray Avenue. Fred Gray was Rosa Parks' attorney. He's still at it in his 90s, right? Still got fire in the belly. And it was really funny in the city of Montgomery. When we said, okay, yeah, we'd like to borrow them. We'll send them back to you. And they said, no, you don't have to send them back. You can have them. Yeah. And I was like, wow, check that out. That's some Southern hospitality. And the woman who worked for the city, she said, well, you have to get your own stop sign. So this is my favorite, insofar as a black man can have a favorite decommissioned Confederate monument. This is Duchy. And from what we can find in our research, this is the first decommissioned Confederate monument. He was taken down in 1900. He was sculpted by a German immigrant, Arthur Bieder. We can find no records of him at all. Basically, he was chased out of town after he sculpted this. He did it in a shed, essentially, and I really like it just formally because it's like archaic, right? Stylistically, and it's a German. So that when he unveiled it, the town was like, literally like, what the fuck? Like, stylistically, they had no, medieval Europe was not in their repertoire visually of what they were expecting. So 2 years after it was unveiled, a group of Confederate veterans, angry at his resemblance to a Union soldier, right, which says a lot about the development of the iconography at that time that you could identify a Union from a Confederate soldier, they yanked him down off of his pedestal. And he was buried right next to the pedestal. The town went on to get a new Confederate monument a few years later. Duchy was forgotten about until 1984. Somebody figured out that he must still be buried there. They dug him back up, and they ran him through a car wash. Now he sits in the Elberton Granite Association's museum. Elberton, Georgia, is a town that sits on what is the biggest granite vein in North America. They produce over half of the headstones in North America. So they have a museum. And I love this display with the AstroTurf. I thought about borrowing it for the show, but Bennett and Chiara were like, no, you're going too far with Duchy. So, Duchy, there are angry people on both sides. So the first, and it was great, negotiations with like the Daniels family, with the Elberton Granite Association, having them hear our plea, I think, is important to the exhibition. Also just negotiating with these different municipalities. But they understood instantly why we would need Duchy for the show in terms of adding a dimension, right, about why these things would have come down, and the idea that they have the first decommissioned Confederate monument, right? They were proud of that. Richmond, Virginia, this is the Jefferson Davis monument from Richmond. The Vindicatrix, which is on top of that very large column, and this is Jefferson Davis down at the base of it. the Vindicatrix, as she's referred to. I love that. There's something very sinister. I thought it stopped at dominatrix. Clearly not. Allegories of vindication. So this is how we'll display, when I was talking about them being, just paint bombed. He was yanked down. He can't stand upright anymore. This is how he has to be displayed. He was also urinated on. So when the conservators, and I love this is now in the possession of the Valentine Museum in Richmond, they're loaning it to us. The conservators said to Bill Martin, the director of the museum, said, yeah, there's a great deal of uric acid we're finding. And so Bill Martin said, if what you're saying is what I think you're saying, I want you to preserve every molecule of that under some magical lacquer. So they did. It's amazing what conservators can do. This is the biggest monument we're borrowing. And he's got the translation of these. Sorry for the text doubling up. Matthew Fontaine Murray, here he's seen as a man of letters. He's considered the father of modern oceanography. I mean, his current and tide studies are still in use in terms of figuring out more efficient shipping channels. He was the admiral of the Confederate Navy. And actually, every time the main route flying to Europe, you fly over the Maori, one of the shelves, underwater shelves in the ocean is named after him. And I notice it every time on the flight to Europe. But again, depicting him as a man of science, right, as opposed to a general, which was the case for a number of the upper echelon of the Confederate Army, right, when they became upstanding members of the community, right, Gilded Era robber barons, if not men of science and letters, in the case of Matthew Fontaine Murray. So we'll be taking the figure and the globe component. Right, this allegory of the seas as immigration and peril. Right there, he's paint bombed. Vula, we're talking about bases. And so this is granite from the base of the Robert E. Lee from Richmond, Virginia. And I don't know if here's the slide. So this is about 100 yards in terms of the area that these granite fragments occupy. About 3/5 of this that you see, that's just the granite from the base of the Robert E. Lee. That all in all was 60 feet high, so 6 stories high, but 40 feet, 4 stories of that was just the base. It was just, the base, so it was all granite. So that's what you're seeing pretty much, more than half of this. So we'll be borrowing around 20 chunks of stone that will have, littered pretty much like that as part of the exhibition. What's important with Richmond is that the removal of Monument Avenue was pretty much ground up, meaning grassroots activism led to their removal. It was not a decision from City Hall down. So here are just some of the fragments. Days without an extrajudicial execution of a U.S. citizen by police. Black trans women. What else is there to say? Right. So this is the Charlottesville Lee. In terms of contextualization, recontextualization, in a few instances, Houston, Charlottesville, and Richmond, the monuments that have come down are in the possession of African-American museums. So I would say that's one of the most radical forms of recontextualization, right? In a couple instances, they've gone to history museums, where you can have a plaque that, or interpretive text that tells you what the thing is. But in the case of I would say a more radical form is a change in stewardship, right, essentially. So Charlottesville, the Jefferson School of African American Heritage, they own the Lee. they're melting it down, giving the bronze to an artist to make a new work to be unveiled in 2 years that'll commemorate the Unite the Right rally. Well, not commemorate the rally, but those who died, the event. In the meantime, they've since melted it down, the Robert E. Lee. We're going to borrow the ingots, the bricks of bronze that are the Robert E. Lee for the exhibition from them. Right? And so I don't know how to check time. Check the time. Is that all I have? 1 minute? Is that what I'm down to? Okay, we got it. Commissioned artists, it's cast of characters, Bethany Collins, Chiara Devontaines, the opera singer who just had his Met debut, Abigail DeVille, Stan Douglas. One of the questions that the municipalities ask when we want to borrow them, you're calling from Los Angeles. You didn't have any skin in this game, the Civil War. And I have to remind them that we actually created the biggest and most effective of all Confederate monuments, and namely the film Birth of a Nation, right? Which did more than any piece of bronze could ever do in terms of spreading the word of the lost cause. So yeah, so this is a list of the artists we're commissioning, and these are just slides of Bethany Collins' project, which is very beautiful. She's transforming the granite from one of the bases of a Confederate monument into rose petals to commemorate a group of black women who responsible for the very first Memorial Day in the United States. Turns out that the first Memorial Day involved reinterring, reburying Union soldiers from a prisoner of war camp in South Carolina. And this group of recently freed slaves, this group of women called themselves the Patriot Association, they recognized the sacrifice that those soldiers had made and wanted to give them a dignified burial. And then they covered, after they buried them, they had the graves covered in flowers and rose petals. And so Bethany is remaking these rose petals out of this granite just to be carpeted on the ground. So I'll stop there so we can go to the question and answer part. It's okay. Said I had a lot. Do I have a black slide in there somewhere? Doesn't matter. Stop at a picture, any picture, pick a picture. Leonardo drew, that's a lot of cotton. So I'll stop there. All right. So should I go?
Hello, can you hear me? Is there any burning question for Hamza?
I didn't know I'd gone far over.
I mean, I'm flooded with questions, but...
Turn it over to the people.
I was wondering also, the juxtaposition between your presentation, Metzil, and Hamza's upcoming exhibition, and what we can learn from each other. Do you think...
From...
What Europe can learn from the example of US and vice versa?
Well, I've done a couple. I was in Belgium, in Brussels, and they've got over 70 Leopold statues. So that's their beast of burden, which doesn't seem to be going anywhere soon. And also in Denmark. But it's interesting in terms of comparisons. But I would say there's a different depth of history in a way, and so they seem a little bit more fixed, let's say here, than in the United States, where the groundwork itself, right? The fact that we're still arguing over the cause of the Civil War means the past is not necessarily the past, and that's also in relationship to the legacies of slavery. So it's still active, I guess, contested at the at the ideological level that would, in some sense, allow for these things to come down in recognition of what they are, right? Whereas I don't know if that's necessarily the case here, in terms of it feels more in terms of the sediments. So.
And do you think that within, there is a question? Okay.
I dreaded dread for this very reason.
Okay, I'll ask a hard question. No, first off, the show seems really great, and thank you for putting it together. I look forward to hopefully being able to see it. Can you talk a little bit about sort of even decontextualize and put it in the museum what it means to bring these monuments back? I love the fact that some of them are going to be in ingot form, some of them are going to be chopped up, but it's like you can't drive down like Hitler Highway in Germany, but you can drive down Jefferson Davis Highway in much of the United States. You've got the sign that's there. Can you talk about, and the thing of the use of monuments where it's like, well, the Nazis were still using this. Can you talk about what it will mean in this context where this history is still contested to bring these monuments back, even if they're desecrated in many ways?
Well, and only, just to make note of what you were saying at first, Charlottesville is the only place that has the appetite for, to put it in polite terms, transformation of the monument, right? So in all cases other than Charlottesville, out of sight, out of mind, right? They've come down, they're objects of contention. Nobody can figure out what to do with what the next move with them is. But they're still, the wound's a little tender, right? So even broaching the subject, in a lot of cases, people are like, no, I'd like to loan it to you, but I know that I'd have to put some kind of mechanism in place that would just reactivate a discussion that we're not able to have right now. So basically, they're like, we got it down. That's as far as we got right now. So Charlottesville, because of Heather Heyer, because of the violent nature of it, they're radioactive. So they're like, no. The city said, no, we can't put it in a crate in the basement. Somebody's got to pull up a truck and get this shit out of here, was basically it. But they didn't want to give it to anybody that would further venerate the objects. So that's what allowed for the transformation of those. In other cases, Richmond, they politely joked. They say, hey, we'll loan these things to you, but it could be a one-way ticket, right? Meaning we don't want them back. It's like, what are we going to do with these things? So, but it's not, in terms of any kind of solution, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing at all around what might, what their future, what their fate is, in a sense. But more with the show is just, I was saying, trying to say this to Jill before, it's like, the way that these things came down, like backing your way, this was out of protest that they came down. I'm gonna refer to that as backing your way into a situation is one thing. But to mark this moment, meaning, I don't know if you're like me, Dred, I did not expect to see a black president in my lifetime. I feel like if anybody black who says they expected a black president, I seriously think they're lying. It'd be easier to say that now, but no. The same with taking these things down. I did not expect these things to come down. And so what does that mean, right? Are we really ready to talk about the lost cause and rip out that kind of wiring, which is a big deal, right? So in terms of marking this moment and then going forward and to use this show to bring that into greater consciousness, to say, okay, let's do this, as a way. So that's so just getting to that step before the other steps about it's like, and what does it mean further? Hope for the best.
Okay, one last, I hope, quick question from Jack.
Yeah, hi. How you doing, Hamza? I just wanted to ask,
okay, thank you.
Right over here. This is a really powerful exhibition that you're putting together, and the imagery could elicit a lot of really intense and angry emotions, and like you just said, it is ripping the Band-Aid off a little bit. So I just wanted to know, what was the pushback on getting some of these pieces, and especially exhibiting in Los Angeles, which has its own kind of controversial, if we want to be nice about it, history about race. So I just want to know the process of kind of pushback and working your way to getting these pieces there, if you could.
Right. Yeah, it was, I mean, 200 came down. We surveyed the 200. Out of the 200, only about upwards of 70 were of interest for various reasons. Art historical, who the personage is, right? We definitely wanted to make sure we got an obelisk in there, you know. And there were, the negotiations were with some municipalities more enlightened than others, right? When we first asked, there was no process. They came down, but they had to figure out, wait, you want to borrow this? It took a year, just from the time that we asked for the time for, and this is by and large the case for Pittsburgh, no, not so much Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Charleston, which we didn't get, New Orleans. They didn't have a mechanism in place to consider, like, what department of the city should deal with this. So it took them a year to then put some kind of thing into place in terms of who's the steward of this object now. We took it down, but if you want to borrow it, who should they talk to? You know, so there were different, you know, meetings with city councils, you know, and in some cases they would put together particular, you know, preservation organizations, right, historic trusts that we would talk to, and there were just varying degrees of reception. Some more resistant, some really into the idea of the exhibition. You know, only in one case was it really actually, if you indulge me just 1 minute, oddly enough, the most contentious case involved talking to the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation has a Confederate monument. Stan Wadey was a Confederate general, the only Native American Confederate general, as one could imagine. How many could there be? The Cherokees, like the other 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast, they owned slaves. Stan Wadey, there was a big fight in the Cherokee Nation. Stan Wadey decided, one faction decided to hitch its star to the Confederacy, to hitch its wagon to the Confederacy, feeling like, well, the Unions fucked us over, so why not join up with these guys? So Stan Wadey became general. In talking to them, I was curious about the issue of the freedmen, the Cherokee freedmen. The Cherokee freedmen are slaves that the Cherokees owned, that after the Civil War, the federal government came to them and said, you can either sign on to the books of the Cherokee or you can become a U.S. citizen. The choice is yours. So a number of them said, we'll stay with the Cherokees. So later, fast forward to the 1980s, the Cherokees wanted to purge their books and only have it be by blood. So they wanted to disown the Cherokee freedmen. Only recently did the federal government step in, and it took them years for the federal government to finally getting around and saying, no. Oddly enough, like we have a deal with you. This is a treaty issue. You have to honor it. So you have to put the freedmen back on the rolls. That topic is still so sensitive for them that they haven't figured out how they want to narrate or talk about it. So we had a totally contentious meeting, and it was productive and actually delightfully contentious. You know, they were like, Matt, you want to talk about this? Basically, it was like that kind of situation, like, why you want to put our business in the street? Like, you know, like, so that was the nature of the meeting, and I was totally shocked that it was like black on brown contention. Like, it's like, well, we'd like to have a Native American artist and representation within the show, but now here we're having a situation where, you know, we're knocking on the door, but yet you're saying, no way can we do this, you know. But I thought that was the most interesting in terms of contention and reasons for saying no. You know?
Thank you very, very much. That was fantastic.
Yeah, it's later.
We'll move to our next session.
Hi, everybody. Must admit, when I saw the schedule of the program and saw that Vula had A, put me after lunch, and B, to follow Hamza Walker, I said, what have I done wrong? But we'll put on a good panel now, really fired up after that extraordinary speech. This session is called Authorship Documentation. There are 4 speakers. And we'll dive straight in with our first speaker, Konstantinos Avramidis, Dr. Konstantinos Avramidis, who's a lecturer in architecture at the University of Cyprus and the principal co-editor of Graffiti and Street Art, Reading, Writing, and Representing the City. Konstantinos.
Thanks a lot. Just to check. Right. First off, I would like to thank the organizers, Romy, Vula, Tom, Austin, and Marina for bringing this thing together. And it's a great honor to be here and reconnect with colleagues and also attend to a series of such powerful presentations. A very short route will take from art to graffiti, and which I consider to be historical markers, right? So graffiti are time and site sensitive. They make sense on the walls they occupy, even though they seem to be irrespective or inconsiderate of their contexts. But what happens when graffiti of various types are documented and come together in a curated book object? So this presentation addresses this line of inquiry through a reflective examination of my design doctoral thesis entitled An Atlas of Athenian Inscriptions. I'll focus on the form rather than the content of the work, and primarily on its capacity to desituate and resituate graffiti. So, which is about, so the research is about the architecture of Athens and the architecture of graffiti and the ways their matrices meet. And I studied this exchange between architecture and graffiti in 3+1 situations. I take no respect, the largest graffiti exhibition ever held in Athens, and in Greece, really, as its starting point. Which is interesting because by desituating graffiti from the original urban context, the exhibition raises questions concerning the site specificity of graffiti and foregrounds the role of documentation. And by including it in this atlas thing, together with the following more overtly political situations, the exhibition is framed as an equally political situation. The other three are the following. So it's the former Nazi detention center, which operates during the Axis occupation. We're talking about the 40s. The Athens Polytechnic, which plays a pivotal role in the student uprising against the Greek military junta. We're talking about the 70s here. And the Bank of Greece, which is a site of recurring political expression in contemporary crisis. I won't discuss atlases as a historian, but as a designer, although my work is based on Abi Warburg's Mnemosine Atlas, which encourages us to question the order of things, places, and times. And the method to develop these 3+1 situations is to use drawings and writings. So I'll start with the writing pages, but before discussing them, I'll have to introduce a drawing first, which is, that's the previous presentation, so it's that. So this drawing locates all the situations in the city while mapping the geographical density of graffiti in every historical period, where now it's text sits, so the texts are divided in two columns, and the text sits on the right, and the corresponding images and references are on the left. So a trick here is that every time the reader enters a section, encounters on the left this map that I've showed you earlier, which makes the subsequent pages take up the space which was occupied by the map, and this way the left column becomes the conceptual space of the city and the right the physical space of the text. So the drawing pages are indexed, the graffiti writings are indexed physically to the specific places on the elevation, and graffiti are serialized according to the matrix of the drawing, and by extension, the matrix of the architectural surface. So both texts and drawings operate as sort of maps. So moving quickly to the situations, the No Respect exhibition takes place at the basement of the exhibition hall of the imposing Onassis Cultural Center, which is the high arts cathedral in Athens. I'm sorry about that. Every inch of the space is covered with graffiti, tags, splashes, and so on, and even cars are brought in to give the sense of streetness. Yet, as the corresponding drawing evinces, the outcome is a series of pieces sitting in perfect order, the one next to the other. So, too much respect for a no-respect exhibition, really. And the minimal spatial references of the basement, i.e. the columns and the grid suggested by the prepared panels, managed to force the pieces to completely conform to them. And also there's also a thematic conformity here, because there is no crisis-related graffiti into this exhibition. So that's the drawing of the exhibition. Situation 1, so the other one was a situation 0, is a former air raid shelter in the center of Athens, which was turned into a detention center when the edifice was occupied by the Nazis in 1941. And the center develops underground, 6 meters below the ground, and it develops in 2 levels. And its walls are covered with numerous well-preserved graffiti, which were written by the inmates in the 40s. The developed sections here, completely different drawings, allow us to conceptualize the basements and the walls as interior panoramas that enable potentially mental escapes from the condition of confinement. In terms of the content, rather than only the form, in terms of the content of the inscriptions, I transformed my photographic studies, which you can see in the middle, into digitally searchable texts, which you can see at the bottom, which allowed me to then search for individual names, and the text starting registering the peripatetic experiences of the inmates, inscribing, so suggesting that the walls, which are seemingly static, are being animated. Oops. So, situation 2, the Athens Polytechnic, which is right now is operating as the School of Architecture. I attended this school. But it is a monumental building, but it's primarily known as the epicenter of the 1973 student uprising against the military junta, which effectively, at the end, ended the junta period. To document the graffiti in this case, I produced a series of photomontages showing how the planned, the line drawing, and the unplanned, so the historical graffiti photographs, meet and disrupt each other. The writings here come from all 3 historical eras, suggesting a multi-temporal reading that encourages and forges new visual, discursive, and historical affinities. And last, the situation 3, which is the Bank of Greece, the Cathedral of Finance and Capitalism in Greece, which was erected in 1932, and also resembles quite drastically the Greek Parliament. To make sense of the mainly anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist, and crisis-related writings, I had to focus on the ways these writings are spatially serialized and temporally sequenced. And to do so, the graffiti are registered as map elevations and a series of record cards that capture the groups of writings before their removal. So the drawings record what once was and disclose what it could have been if no removal practices had taken place. And also, they become a sort of register how competing agents come together, graffiti writers and removalists. So what eventually matters is the relationships that these situations set up when they come together. For instance, we can see a correspondence between the Nazi detention center and the Onassis Foundation, both underground, etc. Yet the exhibition artworks conform to the architectural matrix, whereas the inscriptions in the detention center stretch the matrix of the dungeons. So ultimately, get it there, the atlas suggests a counter-cartography whilst raising questions like what is worth preserving, or who has the right to erase and who has the right to preserve and what. The atlas, of course, is by no means objective or definitive. It reflects the idiosyncratic and perpetually incomplete image of the graffitied Athenian walls. Its main limitation is that it's not an open record, of course, like the inspiring work that Heather, Todd, and Paul, who is not here, have been doing for several years. Yet the atlas shows us that the gestures of documenting is far from innocent, and that its medium, in this case primarily the drawing, frames our thought whilst, of course, at the same time offering us interpretative opportunities. Thank you very much for your attention. Was it there?
Thank you, Konstantinos. Moving on to our next speaker, Srushti Goud, who's Dr. Srushti Goud, a cultural heritage researcher and a postdoc fellow at Core University of Enna, and working on the project MARE, Manuscripts and Books from Asia Reaching Europe, which maps the circulation of Asian books along the Silk maritime routes. Srushti, yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for organizing this Getty and MUDEC, and thank you for having me here. Today I'm going to talk about the ephemeral, recounting the ephemeral festivals in India and the art representation in them. So India, the largest population on earth, 1.4 billion people, 28 states, 8 union territories altogether have so many religions, and with all of that comes so many festivals and so much representation culturally. But since I'm a cultural insider for Hinduism, I would speak of Hindu festivals, but it will also apply to other festivals because I research in communication of cultural heritage. So Indian festivals can be divided as pan-Indian festivals like Holi and Diwali, like the Festival of Lights, folk festivals that are more regional, tribal festivals that we still have many tribes that live in India. So basically worshipping nature and things to do with season, and then fairs and pilgrimages. So every temple, every town has a fair, an event for a day or a week in the year, which is an annual festival. So the first one is Uttarayan. Uttar means north, and Ayanam in Sanskrit means movement. So this is generally happens on the 14th or 15th of Jan, when between the winter and summer solstice, when the sun movement turns towards the north. So Uttarayan happens in this festival celebrated in Ahmedabad and in the state of Gujarat. And in 1989, it was also, they introduced the International Kite Festival in Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, where many pilots of kites come and fly and compete with each other. These are some visuals from the Wikimedia Commons. While kite flyers enthusiasts are competing, the city is also a display of art through kites, through food. And this is an important festival all across India, but then this specifically, I chose this because the representation through kites and kite flying, especially during this season, is a very interesting display of art. Again, so this is a kite museum in Ahmedabad, and it is housed in a very important building designed by architect Le Corbusier. And again, so due to the importance of kites and how beautiful the entire environment looks, the government decided to dedicate a museum specifically for this. Some more visuals of the kites. While the locals also indulge in kite flying, so the entire the sky is filled with kites. Many of them store-bought, and many also made by themselves. Some pictures when I visited this place. It's such an important event that the India Post dedicated a stamp for this festival. The next one is Durga Puja, which is a 10-day festival that happens in Kolkata, West Bengal. And Durga is, in Hinduism, a very important goddess. And this festival is basically dedicated to Durga because she defeats a demon named Mahishasura for 10 days. So she fights, and on the 10th day, she defeats the demon. And in 2021, UNESCO declared it as an intangible heritage of India, specifically the art of Durga Puja in Kolkata. So here you can see that this is a picture of an artisan in Kolkata who works throughout the year to create clay models of Durga, which would be displayed, colored, displayed during the festival, which happens around September, October. Some more images. So this was the festival, this was the Durga Puja last year. So I got this from a friend, and you can see different kinds of displays. Many times they have social messages like equality for women, child abuse. So they try to bring in a lot of different aspects. Even before UNESCO named it an intangible heritage, these things were happening, but now since it's got global recognition, it has increased in its stature. The next one is Thrissur Puram, which happens in Kerala just around this time. So Thrissur is the city, and Puram means festival. So here there's a large temple in the center of the city where the elephants and the mahots are on show, where people visit. There is a competition between, so there are one big temple and two other smaller temples. So there's kind of a competition going on between the elephants and the mahots of the two temples. Here you can see all the umbrellas, the headgear of the elephants, the fans, everything is made and also displayed. Like there are processions for these elephants, and the center elephant is the main elephant for the procession, who is generally appointed for a period of 10 to 12 years because the elephant has to be trained. All the headgears made with metal are generally reusable, and before the event happens, they have a display, like an exhibition, to show what they are going to showcase in this year's event. Many times people can donate money to make these, as well as they can buy some of these. And also, every year there's a new design. Sometimes they reuse it. So there are, it's a lot of things happening for the event. Millions of people attend this event. And these pictures are basically from 10 days ago by a family member who visited this event. You can see the display of art, more umbrellas. So when you talk about documentation and conservation, it's essential for preservation, but also for a continued inspiration for the future generation. So it's important in those aspects to document the ephemeral art. So first of all, when you look at all this, look at people taking pictures and all of that, you essentially understand that there's a need for digital repositories, there's a need for a system. And that needs to be through content and documentation, visual documentation, of course, oral histories and artist interviews, because there are so many people involved in creating and recreating this ephemeral art every year. And of course, contextual information, which we had some speakers talk about. And all along this, you need strategies to preserve them digitally. So as a part of my thesis, I condensed the 3 years into one slide and formulated an 8-stage process where you can utilize my system to communicate, first of all, document, and then communicate values in cultural heritage. So when I say values, I mean anything and everything that a person or community attach to a cultural heritage. So it involves 8 stages, which is creating an initial vocabulary using various sources, assessing the significance through relative importance, which is answering the question, what is the heritage, why is it important, and how important is it? So when you do that assessment, you leave out some values that are not so essential to document. And then producing this set of values for dialogue to the stakeholders, which can be community, administrators, and whoever is attached to that heritage. This will give you multiple perspectives that are held with this, right? And followed by contextualizing the heritage, which I'm sure you all know, followed by prototype design, evaluating the values, and then again, iterating it again. So what are the 3 things that are required for a digital repository to be successful? One is values, of course, because values are the essential qualifying factor for any heritage documentation. Followed by technology, using it like recreating VR experience of the Thrissur Puram through technology. And public participation. You need stakeholders to be involved in it. That's about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srushti. I think that's quite impressive, doing 3 years of work in a single slide. I'm wondering that's the same as the elevator pitch when you get your 30 seconds with your CEO. Right. Our third talk will be given by 2 colleagues, Ilaria Saccani, who's a conservation scientist and adjunct professor of chemistry at the Academy of Fine Arts in Brera, and also she coordinates SESMAR for the European project CAPUS, the conservation of art in public spaces, and she'll be joined by Chiara Fabbri, who's a freelance conservator specialized in contemporary art conservation. Welcome, you two.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank MUDEC, the Getty Conservation Institute, the conference organizing committee, and the institution involved. The growing interest in urban art leads to necessary reflections on the possibility of conserving this type of artwork, especially in cases where it was originally conceived like this, as ephemeral. The present contribution aims It illustrates the conservation challenges of the blues artwork inside the Woodpecker, an iconic building surrounded by nature which at the time of the mural realization was in state of abandonment and which has recently been redeveloped. The eclectic architecture, designed by Filippo Monti in 1965 as a nightclub, was inaugurated in 1968, but closed shortly after. As the site was abandoned, the Woodpecker became a place for art performances, meetings, and rave parties. Inside the main dome is housed a large artwork that Blue created in the early 2000s during an occupation. The work runs all along the introduce and it is made directly on fiberglass. The events that followed the execution of Blue's artwork are not known, but the place and the painting have always had a great success. Local communities, for different reasons and in different eras, have frequented the site in its evolution and are emotionally bound to it. In the past, musical events have also been organized, and in 2017, the Woodpecker was the destination of free-guided tours run by the Italian environmental fund FAI. Blue is an international artist that creates large-sized artworks with political and social content. His stormy relation with the institutions is well known, especially in relation with the exhibition held in Bologna in 2016, when, after the removal of his artworks and their relocation in a museum for a paid exhibition, he decided to cover every work from the walls of the Emilian city, thus sending a very strong signal to the organizers. The same circumstance already occurred in 2014, when Blue erased two of his large works created in Berlin for the Planet Process event. Even though there are no signatures on the artwork, as usual for Blue, the immediately recognizable style and some testimonies do not leave any doubts about its attribution. The work of about 250 square meters consists of white figures with black outlines. The technique used involved the sketchy drafting of white backgrounds with rollers, outlined later with black color applied with a brush to define the design. The painting represents the ferocious animal becoming a meat mincer, like the club itself in activity towards the club audience who were willing to pay a high price for the discotheque exclusivity. The commercial name of the paint used by the artist is unknown. In the past, the artist is known to have used Rover water paints.
The painting was in a poor state of conservation due to the severe exposure to atmospheric agent, together with the numerous floods over the years of abandonment. The fiberglass structure has progressively degraded, and Blue's work suffered the same fate, appearing extremely fragile and compromised to us. The paint film was lifted and decohered in several areas, and the surface was affected also by biological attack. The course is typical of dispersion paint which undergo leaching, especially for plasticizing agent. Amongst the overpainting, we have the inscription, tenetelo antipatici, keep it, you're so unpleasant, and maleducati, so rude, were evident, most likely addressed to the company in charge of redevelopment, worried that they might erase the painting or alter its message with new use. Oh, sorry. So the great interest in Woodpecker and Blues artwork by local communities prompted the municipality of Cervia, the current owner, first in 2018 to insert the area in RUE, urban building regulation, and then to open a call for the site renovation and redevelopment. There are no direct cultural property or restriction on Blues artwork since it is a recent work by a living artist. However, the municipality imposed to the company awarded to the redevelopment project the preservation of Blues painting despite the spontaneous execution, creating an unique precedent in this sense and imposing also a precise final destination as cultural center for community. The conservation of art in public spaces needs further clarification with respect to the contemporary art due to the peculiar relationship with social, cultural, and urban context that qualifies it. So the complex issue of the permanence in the context in which the work was created was addressed. In fact, according to NARA document, every single example of culturally important object must be judged within the cultural context to which it belongs, preserving its artistic, historic, and social values in relation to it. So conservators, in this sense, can play a role of cultural mediators in order to ignite the debate among the stakeholders involved in a preservation project so that the concrete action would be as participatory as possible, as it postulated within the Faro Convention and itself, and earlier in Venice Charter and UNESCO Convention. So the complex approach adopted included a protocol that combined the painting conservation needs without forgetting its flow through time together with stakeholder position. The premise for the restoration was to focus only on the conservation operation necessary for the work, with a view to minimum intervention. So the surface has been considered as a palimpsest, an evolving monument. First of all, the artist's opinion close to blue has been crucial, together with the opinion of contemporary art gallery owner as well as street art expert like Clara Modeo, founder of Another Scratch on the Wall. After the initial analytical phase on the constituent material and determination of biodeteriogens, a cushion cleaning with semi-humid metal has been performed, and in order to restore image continuity. Only the part of the pictorial film present were therefore preserved, implementing a consolidation using acrylic resin in suspension, avoiding any aesthetic intervention, and therefore not covering the inscription and overlays, not to distort the work in dangerous misunderstanding. Only for the inner surface of the dome, a biocide treatment for melanized film J and algae was envisaged. The project includes the maintenance also of the lichens cover on the outer dome vault, whose extension and penetration into the fiberglass would not have allowed a safe removal. Positive effect has also been considered, which may include both protection against atmospheric agent and then thermoregulating effect for safeguarding blues pictorial work. This is the cleaning treatment. And this is the conclusion, not always living happily ever after. The project to preserve blues work was completed in October 2021 after a month of on-site work and more than a year of preliminary planning. But despite the constraint imposed, the Woodpecker reopened in June 2023 as an elite nightclub. After the construction company had carried out some retouching to cover the overmission, creating a strong antithesis with the work itself, which was born as a social critique, and also with the desire to renew this message through a careful conservative treatment. So the initial intention and promise to devote the site to cultural initiative has been betrayed, and only few words remain for the first announcement, which has not yet become a reality. The hope is that the municipal administrations will take care of ensuring observance of the call proposal, giving the community the chance to see the painting as it was created by the artist, so free and accessible. Thank you for the attention.
Fantastic, thank you. And I heard Lizeth coming. Yes, there you are. Our final talk for the day is from Anna Lizeth Massa Delgado. Lizeth is a professor at NCRIM, and you have the full what NCRIM stands for in your program. but it's the National School of Conservation, Restoration and Museology in Mexico City. Lizeth is a conservator restorer with a master's degree in art history, but she specialized particularly in contemporary art conservation as well as in graffiti and street art. Hi, Lizeth. All yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking my proposal. Thank you for my colleagues for hard work, and it's a really pleasure to be here with you. Okay. The diversity of street expressions has expanded a lot in the last decades. The diversity is so wide that a challenge is to analyze its registration and conservation from different perspectives and to complete to a knowledge to be able to understand that we are going to face. Even correct denomination, the name of them is still debated. There are those who call a piece of graffiti because it's made with aerosol, even when there are no letters, or those who speak the muralism, neomuralism, or urban art because of the size of the work or because it was made with permission. And we are broad debates, but close at the same time. At the end, we all have common language in the regard. It has been observed that the way in which these works are created mostly corresponds to these three categories: authorized, when the creators ask permission from the community, the authorities, or directly from the owner of the property; commissioned, when we are generally management from the brands or a product, or even local governments promote for this type of works as they accompany a political campaign; and finally, the clandestine or spontaneous works, and have always existed and will not cease to do so, because that gives meaning to the type expressions. You can see different materials, different expressions, different places. Let's not forget that many artists even continue to this duality. They can work clandestinely with graffiti, but sometimes they create larger format works that require a permission or another type of infrastructure to carry out their artworks. In the street, everything coexists and everything is valid. Now, I will share with you a little bit about Urbarte, conservation project which began in 2011 with the purpose of registration, diagnosis, and evaluating the conservation of street art, including urban art, graffiti, and various types of street art expressions. It's a part of the academic and research projects, and they are carried within the seminar workshop of restoration of modern and contemporary art at my university. Also, it began as a university research project. To date, it has been linked to the other instances and the institutions, which has greatly enriched the project and in turn has severed. It's a great exchange of knowledge and creation of professional networks of collaboration. With a focus on conservation restoration, the project aimed establishing diverse collaboration with creators, managers, curators, and the other communities where these types of urban intervention insert. The principal objective to Urbarte, when start, is register, diagnosis, and conservation in general. It's global. You can see in this part, you can see the first phases from the work, but in this moment, add two new lines from the research, the restoration of works, especially those in mural format, collaborating with artists, based in consultants requested by them, linking with trained institutions and artists, and we will do different interviews. Here are some of the activities carried out during these years. 3 international meetings have been held, covering topics such as conservation, restoration, management, and dissemination, as well creation and materiality. It's so important to include everything to agents work with around for this expression. Visits have been made with the local artists and cultural managers to learn about various urban art projects. Works were made during the events, which have to serve to conduct research on materials and conservation issues. There have also been some exhibition for works. You can see in this area, some artists do different artworks from the gallery or from the other kind of exhibitions. Currently, as a part of Urbarte Restorations, 2 murals projects from the collective Tepito Artaca, who is a relevant artist group to understand public art in Mexico City since the 70s. It's been carried out. They work to 2 different contexts, but both are interested in preserving the memory of their community. You can see some explains for events and collaborative activities with other institutions and initiatives interested in the study of this type of artistic expressions. This has been carried in of the same way throughout more than decades of work. Some of these collaborations have focused in the study of materials, others on the study of creative dynamics, and others on the dissemination and conservation of this type of works. The interests around of these artistic productions are very diverse. We work with different institutions, private and public, and it's interesting. For example, I don't know if you know, Mexico have Unidad Graffiti, because it depends the police. It's so interesting about it. We have collaborated with other colleagues and artists in different places, such as Athens, Santiago de Chile, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Washington, D.C., Madrid, Valencia, Fansara, and several cities in Mexico. This has a result of the generation of research and collaboration networks necessary for the conservation and research of this type of artistic expressions. Why, why we are interested in documentation in this type of artistic expressions? You can see artists, you can see photographers, you can see murals. Starting from the premise that the documentation is the most viable way to conserve these types of expression artists. Since the way cannot always last for a long time because they are exposed to different problems, from those related to their materiality to those that can be covered for the new works, or in Spanish, when pisadas, and covered with the other artists. Documentation provides us the information that otherwise would not be possible to have if it were not the record to make these works. However, the question is how to do it and who does it. When we think in graffiti, perhaps the image Martha Cooper and her camera comes to my mind, or Anders Kastelman, you can see the photo, or Henry Chalfan. Now, from a conservation perspective besides photography, what the other type of documentation we do use to rescue and preserve collective memory? I ask you, how many of you have in this moment photographed from graffiti of murals in your cell phones? Or in the last days, how many of you share information or photographs in the social media? This is now how we are generators of documentation from its most primary moment, and we make it more complex according to what we need. Sorry. Well, this has been in a brief summary for a project that is among the objectives that registration and documentation of street art, then how to do in an adequate and useful way from our profession. We are some from the experience that have been and had. Although they are not the only ones, they have worked for the established objectives. In the discussion with my colleagues in this panel, we enrich the experience. Based on that experience work over the years had been researched, it's a list from some of the ways which the type expressions have been documented. Now, that we do this information, how to do organize, and how to make too accessible to our colleagues and communities. It is will important to determine the objectives that we have the document, to be very conscious and responsibility not only to the document, but to have and correct the storage and future use to the material, to be able and do it in the best way, and above all to make it functional at different times. As a part of the activities of Urbarte, I will show you an example for the register cards. We elaborated several years ago to carry out on the diagnosis and documentation in the field and diverse artistic expressions. This has to be adjusted to the complement from the experience that have been had with the work in the street. This documentation has not only served to record the works of the street art, but also to collect basic information to serve and the basis for the conservation, restoration, and support to the investigation and this type of artworks. Gives a parameter of the state of conservation in which it was when the record was made. So can follow up on the permanence of work. In addition, the change in the state of the conservation over time. You can see in this area we have a database, for example, for geolocalization, and you can see for different information about the artists, the materials, the context, and not discriminate. We register graffiti or urban art or street art or the different expressions on the street. You see this video, I know. There is still so much to discuss and analyze about the conservation of this type of artistic expressions. However, from Roberto's experience, how the following is proposed. Documentation is a viable alternative for the conservation in street art. However, it's important to define what type of documentation is the most appropriate for this purpose. Understanding the context in which these works are created will be decisive in the assessing whether or not to conserve them. The materials, the message, even the polychromy you see, and the type of the intervention carried on the street provide fundamental information on their understanding and their possible permanence or transcendence. As you remember, for example, when you see the manifestations, the color is so important. Maybe the purple refers to feminist manifestations, or the red, or you can see different colors, and it's so important. When this is a little details from the like a documentation from this building that I know you see in the different social media. This is not to conclude a topic, to be continued. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lizeth. It's always nice as a chair when you have a silly little paddle to give people their final minute, when it's about a minute to go and you see someone put a slide up that says final thoughts. Yes. Don't have to do it. Could the other speakers please join us? I'm just going to get my... Great. I always feel slightly strange about being the chair of the session, but the only person not in a chair. I don't want any sort of male white domination. I should be at the same level as you guys. Thank you so much, guys. And I'm just going to kick off with a couple of questions about documentation in particular, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for some questions from the audience. But I think the first question, and I'm going to start with you, Lizeth, because your last slide kind of framed it beautifully. So, you know, you've each very eloquently spoken about the importance, the role of documentation in general when they're thinking about all kinds of things with public arts, including conservation. And I think everyone, would agree with that sort of concept. But then when it comes to sort of practical terms, you have to make decisions about what you're going to document and how you're going to do it. And I think I kind of posed a slightly provocative question to each of you with our notes the other day about, you know, what are the most important types of documentation beyond a good photo and a documentation report? And I think you were getting at that, Lizeth, so why don't we start with you just to give us some general thoughts.
Okay. It's a difficult question. No, I think it's so important, not only documentation for our profession. I think need to include in the first from community, because I talk with different colleagues about it. In the first, I think, we need to explain very, very well and clearly to the community what happened with our work. And then, yes, we need a good photograph or a video, and maybe we can work with a professional photographer in this place. But I think it's so important, like our work, have a good repository or have a technology to come back to this information. If we don't organizing good this information, or not put the dates or the details or the names, for example, the photo, it's a lost information. Maybe it's a big problem, because we are accumulation from different material or information, and we don't have more about it. And have the options, for example, I think in a good repository or storing on this type of information, classify, and I think it's fundamental. And I think we work together with the other areas, helps to the conservation, photographers, communities, or, for example, the artists, because now social media, it's I think it's a big repository, because many urban artists, street artists, or graffiti writers have better documentation than us. For example, like a building, like a big building in Los Angeles. And I think it's so important to sharing, not only in our computer, sharing this information with other areas.
We'll get to the repository concept, I think, in the next question, because that's another theme. Konstantinos, why don't you share some thoughts beyond the beautiful way you organize some of your photographs and information, but are you thinking that there are other forms of documentation that would be essential to prioritize?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think, I mean, even Brassai, who I saw that there's an exhibition on Brassai's work in Milan right now. Hope to get the chance to have a look. It was Brassai who said back in the 60s, I think, that graffiti than anything else depends on documentation, and he puts it quite nicely, saying that even if there is no lens or if there is no hot lava to preserve a graffito, they're destined to die. So there's a historical link between graffiti and documentation already. Yet, and of course, it's also, I mean, as you said, there's also a continuous link between photography and social media, and of course videos can make even they complicate the documentation even more because they give us a more experiential view. In my work, I'm testing something else through the mediums of the architect, which is the drawing, which I think has another benefit. The drawing has the ability to allow us reperform the drawing gesture by tracing it over. And in so doing, I think it opens up potential graphic knowledges and interpretative opportunities. I mean, and in so doing, it's also no surprise that archaeology doesn't rely only on photography to document ancient dipinti, but they also use drawings and also 3D scannings right now, but I mean on top of all these. So there is still value into how you interpret while you're documenting, how you interpret something, because at the end of the day, every single documentation medium, one way or another, it frames the way we will see and understand what we're looking at.
Thank you. Laura, the same question to you, but I think where your talk was slightly different to the others is that you were talking a lot about documenting an actual conservation treatment, which adds a whole level of extra need and complexity, because if you're documenting an artwork, it could be from a particular moment in time, and you're going through multiple stages. So, I mean, what are your general thoughts about, the sort of essential documentation and what goes beyond that?
Yes. No, it's off. Okay.
Oh.
Works? No.
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
This one?
Okay.
There's one.
That's one. Okay. Okay. Yes, for conservation purpose, I think that it is important also to document materials, and in our experience also the artist's position about conservation. This could be done, for example. Okay. This could be done, for example, with artist interviews. We did it with Capus Project, for example. So we register with audio excerpt or video excerpt interviews with artists, including adapting the Inca protocol and including also questions about the position of the artist, about the permanence of his work. And it is important also to document all the the stakeholder position on conservation topic. So the community, and if it's really as participatory as possible, then it's fundamental to take note of all the position of the stakeholders involved. And yes, but I think that it is different. It can vary if the artwork is commissioned or not. It depends if it's unauthorized, but it assumes the importance for the community, for example. In this sense, it should be a sort of documentation. Post-realization it's different. It's not always possible to collect all these values, all these positions at the same time. But for commissioned artworks, I think it is possible to do that and to accompany the realization with a sort of a sheet of digital repository that could accompany the maintenance of the artwork.
Thank you. So, I mean, Srushti, one of the things that just leapt out of me through beautiful slides was I'm missing sound, I'm missing noise, I'm missing movement in seeing all the kites flying to the sky, missing the smell, all those other senses that you experience in person. How does that fit into a realistic way to document an extraordinary, complicated thing like a festival?
So first of all, you need to see whose art is it. And then you need to see what all aspects are important to those people who associate with that art. For instance, the Trishur Puram, it's not just about the visuals. It's about the percussion instruments that go. There are people who train for it for several years, and the experience itself is unbelievable, because when the percussion instrument, it's called chenda, it's like a long drum-like thing that you wear. And so you need to document the noise, the sound. So I think it has to be a very case-to-case basis of how you bring about the essence. Of course, you will never be able to relive or recreate it to its entirety, but then maybe 70-80% can be put into an experience. For instance, now VR is doing a lot of trying to bring in all the senses, like sense of smell and sense of touch. So all of these things probably can be introduced in slow, like small chunks. But yeah, definitely to experience it, to go there and live it.
I mean, another thing, this is just a general question, I think, for any of you who'd like to answer this, because it struck me that from your talks and from the session right before lunch, so many of the sort of powerful images are those of people reacting to the artwork, or people reacting to the installation, or people, the reactions of people, community, visitors, and you can't stage that so much. So how does that feed into the sort of more official photography of some amazingly high-resolution image of a mural or a graffiti piece? It's how Lizeth, you're nodding your head, so I'm going to take that as you'd like to say something.
For example, I think in different things. For example, it's an idea, but I think we need to assume the documentations corresponds to the time of when they did take. For example, I think in the graffitis over trains in the New York in the 70s or 80s, in these photos, we can't to see the movement, only see the angle to the photographer, no? But it's not a problem because we understand it's in the other moment. I think maybe we are quickly, and we want now, today, we want to have all the experience. It's so different. And the last years, for example, we worked with Greg Castleman, and he gives him photos in a pen drive, and because he thinks it's not the photos no works, it's not sharing with the others. No, it's an open repository, and in this moment we have more technology and more possibilities to documentation and the other specialized. But what I think we need to assume with what kind of documentation we have with the past, or maybe we will have in the future. And it's I think it's important to do with the responsibility and conscience we have in this moment, and we have our possibilities in space, in context, in value, and I don't know, in the money, in different contexts, and maybe it's okay if only we have the photographies, but we need to organize good, because it's important to work to the future. I don't know, explain very well.
No, it's great. Does anyone want to say anything else? If not, I'm going to jump onto databases and repositories. Why don't we do that? And Srushti, I'm going to start with you, because obviously that was a big part of your thing. I mean, so this is the sort of the reality check time. I think it's easy to say more and more documentation. You can document all these different aspects and blah blah blah, but it has to be managed. It has to be retrievable, findable, accessible. All of these things, and obviously a repository is a beautiful concept, and you've got a long way in actually developing something. But just what. Apart from the obvious one of this massive data that somehow has to live somewhere, be connected, that everyone find it, what does that involve to bring a repository into a sort of useful state?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
That's my job.
So I'm going to say something very controversial. We need to let go of a few things to keep the more important things that are valuable to us in its original and in its most honest form. So when you document something, especially since I work with cultural heritage, you need to see all the various aspects that make it so important for people involved. And then, make it accessible and make it communicate all the aspects, which is basically values. Even you spoke about values in your talk. So I think that is a way to go. That's the solution I came up with, and that's what I understood, because the turn to digital has become so massive now that somehow the essence of what we are trying to document and systematize is lost, and it's now more about technocratic beautification and high quality images and good multimedia. But then what is the content that you are actually documenting? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. So, yeah.
Konstantinos,
Actually, I want to pick it up from where you left it. Thank you for that. I think what we leave out at times is more important than on what we usually focus. And there is a reason why this is the case. For instance, the things that are considered to be marginal, like graffiti, because we've been talking about art, so what is worth preserving? The right question most probably is, who decides what is worth preserving? And in what way? Who funds what is worth preserving? So in this question, and eventually we usually get the answer that, graffiti, contemporary graffiti is vandalism, so it will be left out. And we will consider value, monetize or culturally wise, primarily the urban art, the large murals, the virtuosity of the artist who is paying attention to all these things. Whereas the hastily made tag is something that we shouldn't consider, even though there might be an insane sophistication in writing someone's name. And also, or even a slogan might be important information for us in the future. And not only information, it might tell us a lot about the context or the moment. It might tell us the moment. So I think more than thinking what we preserve or what we document is the places we could choose to document and start documenting them in a fashion where we don't exclude a lot of things, and we could then perhaps have a richer repository, if you may, of a place where we don't exclude the where, we don't exclude the slogan, we don't exclude the graffiti, we don't exclude even the, I don't know, the dog urination maybe. I mean, all these are data that tell the story of a particular place and might and it might actually, all these layers allow us to appreciate in a greater depth how it is being made and remade. So it's more about the transformation of places rather than how things remain frozen.
Should cut right. We have 7 minutes. Oh, great. I had fantastic. I was about to say, let's go and have coffee. Any questions from the audience? And the lights are really low, so I can't see anything. But if anyone does have a question, please put your hand up. I can't.
Okay, thank you.
You're up.
I just wanted to ask, as you were talking about documentation, how do you navigate the difficulty of language? Because you all work in your own respective contexts, but most contemporary languages are laden with values of mastery. So as you try to document and make these things permanent or make them subsist for longer than they were intended, how do you navigate that relationship of mastery embedded in language? And that's my question.
Would you like to direct it to someone? Yeah. Yeah, Ilaria, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, in our case, the documentation for conservation purpose has been done in bilingual, so it's always in local language and in English. For example, for a digital repository that we did during a European project was bilingual most of the time. But yeah, there's an issue. For example, we can't be able to translate everything, and most of the time it doesn't make so much sense to translate expressions, so it's not the same. And even though if we make videos of the communities that it's maybe discussing about the topics of over mission vandalization, it's not always possible to transfer this emotional side on translating, and it's not so easy. Yeah.
You did mean language, not terminology, language, right? Both, yeah. So could someone talk about the sort of terminology side of it?
Yeah. We we did a glossary on terms, but it's easier on conservation terms. So it was a glossary on conservation terms and on alteration. So it's very technical, but not on the other level of interpretation of the artworks. So it's not, I know it's not a complete translation of the terminology. and so the dialogue in some case could be limited in understanding what you exactly intend for a term.
Srushti?
I'll just... sorry. No, please go ahead. I'll just add to that yes, and it's a really important question when it comes to language. Thankfully, we all here in this panel, we're focusing on local scenes, so we do have access to the particular languages, but at the same time, except for the content of the language itself, we should not probably overlook the graphic look of language. When something is written in red, the red might be even more important than what it is being written on a particular context, just to add that.
So in my case, it's very strange because in India, we speak many languages. So the documentation also, when you, of course, if you're from a region, you'll speak the local language and you'll celebrate and view all of the festivals in the language, so your experience is different. But then when you do it in English, no matter what you do, there is always that a little bit of reductionist approach that comes into picture. You cannot help it. But yeah, like she said, you can provide a glossary, you can provide more contextualize as much as possible when you are documenting it in English other than the local language, in order for it to have more meaning. But definitely when you, so before this I was working in a museum in Israel, and there were people who spoke Hebrew and people who spoke Arabic and English. So all three of them were displayed as like written things, but then since it was a Jewish museum, the importance was more clearly expressed in Hebrew. So you cannot help it when you switch between languages.
I have a question. Is that okay? I'm in the middle. Hi.
Yes, of course it is.
So in Minneapolis, I have a few friends who are street artists, and some of the things that they've described to me about graffiti art is part of the thrill is its deviance and going out in the middle of the night and running from the police and trying not to get caught, or seeing how long your piece can stay up before either the authorities paint over it or another street artist comes and crosses out your piece. And so with this documentation of especially graffiti art, a kind of art that's always been on the margins and it's always been deviant, it's kind of bringing it back into the center of culture. And I'm curious, have you all spoke with like graffiti artists about the process of documenting their work, and like how do they feel about this new longevity of a type of art that is created to be temporal?
Let's try and get a couple of quick. That's obviously complicated question, but
yeah. I'll take my architect hat and I'll put my graffiti writer hat on now. As a member of the scene, documentation has always been a key element of the development of graffiti. And graffiti writers actually historically have mastered photography. And nowadays they're mastering videos as well, because we're now beyond Instagram, we're already in TikTok, so videos are getting more prominence. But the documentation and also the dissemination of this documentation, especially in the early days, has changed the way the graffiti writing has been taught on and passed from one generation to the next, really, and actually traveled the world. But yeah, I'll leave it here so as not to take too much time.
And I think, even though I'd love this conversation to go on, because it's triggered, just do a minute, Lizeth, go on.
One?
Because we're going to keep everyone from their tea.
No,
Yeah.
in our case, for example, from Ugarte, it's interesting because we have different interviews with graffiti writers, and it's interesting in understand the materials, the activities, the context. And when the project started, it was so difficult because it's what do you want this information? It's for us, it's not for conservators. No? But in this moment, not all graffiti writers, but work together, for example, because interest in different covers of materials, or for example, in the other way, we need to retire this painting. And it's interesting because on social media have a lot dissemination about the works, but in our case, we work together in some cases because the project it's interesting not only in the mural format, it includes the tags, the pieces or the old school about that because it's part of history of graffiti. If you want, maybe take a coffee and discuss about it.
I think that's a perfect way to get people talking and coffee. Thanks for the question. I mean, I was actually wanting to get somewhere there about this sort of the clash between applying these very sort of principled conditions, and of course, even with a group of artists like graffiti artists, we'll have a full range of people who want it and don't want it and everything in between. So.
Our next panel is the artists panel, which will be moderated by Katia Inozetseva. Katia was head curator at Garage in Moscow, and currently she's adjunct curator of contemporary art at MUDEC. Thank you, Katia.
Buonasera a tutti. Good evening to everyone. Thank you. I'd like to I'm really grateful to the museum and to the Getty for organizing this rather exceptional event. And also, it's my big pleasure to have a conversation again with the artists. So tonight, we will have the talk with the three artists who come from really different backgrounds, but who navigate across the media, and they operate within the public space with a particular emphasis on the body and the performative experience. So the first artist I'd like to introduce you is Alexandre Arecea. So he was born in Trinidad, Cuba, and probably you still remember the great artist collective Los Carpinteros. Alexandre was part of this group, and then starting from 2003, he started his, let's say, solo path as an artist and a filmmaker. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Wow, what an amazing opportunity. I have to thank obviously Getty and MUDEC, but I also have to thank especially to Rosa Lowinger, our conservator, who actually pushed me to send the proposal for this talk today. And it's a blessing to be here listening all the stories and your research. And you know, it's the kind of moment that definitely is going to be something important in my career, departing from here. So I would like to start with this image. Thank you, Katia, for the introduction of Los Carpinteros, because I thought that I have to do it, but you did it for me. And so departing from 2020, leaving Los Carpinteros precisely, 2004, sorry, departing from Los Carpinteros in 2003, I wanted to focus in a new direction. And that focus certainly was inspired by the idea of my neighborhood. I wanted to start addressing issues that relate to my neighborhood in Havana and dealing with the social environment and space, and dedicate some of my investigation to work with the community. So one of the first projects that I created is titled Sudor, Sweat in English. And my intentions at the time was to gather around this public basketball court in my neighborhood, to gather the different actors that conform in a way my community, including artists, including two basketball teams, street basketball teams, and art critics and neighbors. And essentially what I wanted to do is to give a sort of a platform to everybody. And that platform consisted in several stages. The first stage basically was to set up a game between these two basketball teams, and the result of the basketball of the game was recorded, mostly focusing the camera toward the basketball the hoop, the basketball hoop or the basketball board, and whatever happened there, the results, then I'm going to edit all that information, and I'm going to organize an event the following week in which I'm going to invite most of my neighbors and most of the art critics in Havana at the time and people involved in the area to witness this game that we have set up initially in the previous week. And now they can witness that game through sound and image. But the actors, in this case the players, they are around the crowd, but not necessarily playing. So you are witnessing a game in which actually it creates a sort of a sensation of being in a sort of a democratic space in which we all share the same situation, but you are unable to change the results of the game. So in that sense, for me, this is the earliest stage of something that evolved with time, and that evolution also is related to the fact that this is the first project that I do as a solo artist, but this is my last project in Havana as well at the same time. So from there, I moved to Spain, and later on I moved to New York, and I was invited at the time at the Bronx Museum to exhibit this particular work, which is in a way an evolution of that first stage that I enacted in Havana with the basketball court. But this time I'm exhibiting at the museum an object that definitely relates to a sculpture, but on a sculpture that somehow it calls the attention because it tries to invite people to play. But at the same time, you are unable to play with this particular sculpture because the basketballs are attached to the ground, so you are not able to actually play. So in this case, the idea was more about the subjectivity that the object provoked. And it's more in relation to the idea of the sculpture in the regular basis that you can find in any museum, with no intentions besides being standing there, no other intentions. So one thing that for me was important with this new possibility of creating a project that relates to sports, and it calls for me the attention, obviously, that the Bronx Museum, when they invite me, the idea of basketball as a street game is so developed in these areas that makes sense to have something or an object like this one at the museum. But of course, like I always say, I keep my works always open. None of my works are closed in the sense that they are always accepting new possibilities. Because the same way you move from Havana to Madrid or New York, you have to understand that the conditions obviously are completely different, and in that sense, you have to, in a way, to adapt to that new context. So in that sense, I'm going to play a project that, although it's not related to orange tree, which is the previous word that I show, it actually shows the new intentions of the sculptures that I'm trying to create. And in this case, it's a project that I developed for Park Avenue in New York City. Most of my work, in a way, relates to the idea of this dialogue with architecture, what architecture provides you and what in turn you bring as in terms of art as part of that dialogue. And one of the things that I have to say regarding this particular project is when I arrived to New York for the first time, and I know that many of you probably have experienced the same thing, is that you arrive to a city that it shows you an enormous power through these particular landmarks, which are, Empire State, Cherry Netherland, you name it. And one thing that for me when I arrived to New York City is like, what can I offer to this city that this city doesn't have? Because this city has everything. But at the same time, those landmarks are so powerful that you think that you have nothing to offer. But in a way, you do. And one thing is like, I can try to create sculptures based on these buildings in which they are totally twisted. Or in the case of the Spinning Top series I created, I put buildings on top of spinning tops. And one thing that was really interesting to me, I never told anyone that those spinning tops, they are actually rotate. And while we are filming on Park Avenue, the documentary on this project, I see a kid that approached to one of the spinning tops and immediately started to rotate them. I mean, we're talking about a 20 feet tall structure, and that a kid is able to rotate. That single moment for me was magical because that was the intention. The intention is to provide to people or whoever walked around Park Avenue the possibility to play with these objects that they look enormous, but they actually you are able to transform them. So in that sense, for me, the idea of transformation is, or working with architecture in that sense, is always, something in the making. To create a strategy based on the possibility of creating a project at a certain point is always something very difficult, because perhaps your intentions are going in one way and the invitation that you receive, it goes in a different way. But as for me, this learning curve, in a way, have been like to have the intention to work on something that is, in a way, pharaonic. And when you have the possibility or you get the invitation, then you propose that project. So in that sense, when I was invited to Coachella, a festival, music festival in California, one thing that for me was very interesting is the public who assist to Coachella, obviously younger people, and I want to, in a way, to bring to this stage an idea that relates to history or recent history that probably these young people doesn't know. And one thing is to keep, in a way, giving the possibility of working with architecture in a meaningful way. In this case, for instance, I have this project that is titled Dreaming with Lion, inspired in the book of The Old Man and the Sea, created for Miami Beach, specifically Bafana Beach. So basically what I did was to take beach towels and stack them and create this sort of text, and using, what is available at the beach, which are basically towels, And in that sense, we are talking about here we are in the middle of COVID. Things are very difficult, to gather people around. But at the same time, you want to tell stories. And this is a story of, so I know that, I'm rushing now. But I started with the orange tree, and I want to finish with orange functionally. And I spoke about the idea that for me it's important to remain always open, because in this case, we're talking about Orange Functional is the result of what social media can make to you. And I was exhibiting Orange Tree at the Bronx Museum, later on at private collections, and people started to interact with the work in ways that you see that they want really interact with the work. So I decided to change and give Orange Tree a new life. So I created Orange Functional, which basically is to create a platform for people to play, but at the same time, because this piece has been evolving in a way that most is going to new collections, or people are buying the work in different collections, I'm now tempted to create a sort of a map in which display the location of this particular project, and at the same time using the programs that have been executed of how people play with it, and display all that as part of a program that I'm a future envisioning about the work. So basically, this is the story of Alexandra Rechea so far.
Many thanks for this very variable story. Let's wait a bit. A performative element is here. It's my great pleasure and honor to invite here Dred Scott, who I'm quite sure many of you know. And starting from 1989, when Dred Scott became actually the center of national controversy in the States, at that time, students, and for many of us, it was a symbolical story and a canonic gesture that influenced many processes that we are living in now. So Dred will talk about his recent large-scale project. So please, over to you.
Okay, this is going to be a whirlwind tour. I'm going to talk really fast, take notes, whatever. No. So this is a slide of outside of New Orleans, in a town called Laplace. It is, if you can see, it says Major 1811 Slave Uprising Organized Here. That is how the state of Louisiana commemorated one of the most central and important events in U.S. history. You're driving by at 40 miles an hour. You're never going to see that about half-inch high text. What I'm talking about is a project that talks about that history called Slave Rebellion Reenactment. The work was a community-engaged project that involved 350 reenactors over the course of 2 days, marching 24 miles, reenacting the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. We marched down the Mississippi River from Laplace down to Kenner, which is where the airport is in New Orleans, and ended up in this French Quarter in the city itself. A central element of the artwork was how the past not only sets the stage for the present, but how it resides in the present in new form. This particular project was built upon previous projects, both of mine, but more importantly, of the artworks that are community-engaged artworks that lots of other artists had done, as well as activist strategies for talking about history. Specifically, artists like Jeremy Deller's Battle of Orgreave, or the spectacles that the Soviet Union did reenacting the storming of the Winter Palace, but also things like the Wall of Respect, which Nomi talked about, and New Orleans activists who were actually talking about removing some of the statues that Hamza talked about. As I said, we marched from the town of Laplace, which is there, and we marched downriver over the course of 2 days, covering 24 miles. And if you were going to work or coming home from shopping and you saw 350 reenactors, some of them on horses in period costume, chanting "On to New Orleans, freedom or death, we're going to end slavery, join us," you'd be like, what the hell am I looking at? And in that space, people could sort of rethink a lot of what they thought they knew about the past. But it was a community-engaged project. It was a project that was built over the course of 7 years, and it involved lots of meetings with people. This is the Black Student Union at Tulane University, which is a major school in the New Orleans area. We also met with students and people at Xavier University and Dillard, which are historically black colleges and universities. And the artwork was epic. It involved lots of people over a great deal of time. But it was really me gaining permission to do work in a city that I didn't live. I don't live in New Orleans. I live in New York. It's about 1,000 miles away. And winning the community to both understand this history but want to participate in various ways. We had to make costumes, and if you ask most people what did enslaved people wear, they would have said burlap sacks, but that's actually not true. So we looked at images, paintings from Saint-Domingue, largely the French Atlantic, to see what clothing people wore, and actually made costumes that were historically accurate. But we also did them through sewing circles. You could see the man on my left, your right, had just been taught to sew and is making his own costume. People made costumes all around the country, but a lot of people made their own. But some people made them for people, like if they were elderly and knew they couldn't march 24 miles, they made a costume for somebody else, or perhaps they were white and they knew they couldn't be one of the reenactors, but they wanted to support it. But it was also a way for us to meet people in various communities, having lots of different sewing circles. We had to make flags because we knew that the rebels in 1811 carried flags, but there was no documentation of what they carried. The reason we know they carried flags was the general at the time wrote to the governor saying there's 500 brigands in the field. They're marching in formation under flags, so we knew the size of the rebel army. We knew that they were disciplined. It wasn't just a bunch of people going all crazy. It was a military formation, basically, and that they had flags. And we knew they would not have been the French flag or the American flag, but we didn't know what they were, so I had to imagine what they were. This is a flag bearing a Ghanaian adinkra that means hope and confidence. This is death or liberty. But it's not misspelled French, it's Louisiana Creole, and this was another flag that we had. This is sort of a rehearsal practicing to sort of walk like an army, and this is just a conversation with some people about why they might want to participate in this.
Recruiting others into it. Why would you, a 21st century guy, want to go walk 26 miles in some French colonial clothing?
Because this crazy guy named Dred Scott asked me to do it.
The idea of people coming together to pool their energy in that way. I feel like we really need that.
This is the closest that I'll ever be able to come to experiencing what my ancestors experienced.
I'm surrounded by comfort. So what happens if I eliminate all that and just the only connection that I have is with the people and the purpose?
It's important for this generation to know that you're not the descendants of slaves, you're descendants of people that were enslaved, and you're at your current position because of the resistance.
To know that your ancestors fought is enough to build up a sense of dignity for a child.
So if people do know about this history, I think it'll spark rebellion in people today.
People are reevaluating the position of black people in American society in a way that they haven't for about 40 years. And it's not just for black people. This is a question of people who wish to be free from this oppressive society.
Well, I think just in white supremacist culture, there's this idea of disconnecting myself from the people that came before me that I'm related to. I have to own that narrative. I have to be honest with that, how that's influenced me. What's that granted?
I don't think it's a reenactment. I think this is learning about the material, social, spiritual costs, but also the practice of insurrection.
So this is what it looked like if you were seeing it. These are some performance stills, and I say performance stills because the project is now shown in galleries and museums, but I'm just going to show you 6 or 7 images of what upriver New Orleans looked like. And as you can see in this, there's a lot of modern stuff that's in the background, a train trestle or something with a lot of reenactment. People try and excise the modern and say, this is exactly how it was in 1863. I'm doing the opposite of that. As a visual artist, I'm really interested in the clash of the past and the present. And so I didn't transport the audience back in time. I transported an army of the enslaved from the past into our present and ruptured into it. So they're marching past an oil refinery, which is part of Cancer Alley, which was one of the most toxic regions in the United States. And I don't have time to talk about all of what it is, but these oil refineries were literally put down on top of sugar plantations and many times on top of the graves of enslaved people. And this is us marching in the French Quarter itself. And this is a bit what it sounded like. And so this was not a project about slavery. This was a project about black joy, about liberation and freedom. These were freedom fighters. These were formerly self-emancipated, formerly enslaved people. That's what people were embodying and reenacting. And as I said, these performance stills come back into the art world as performance stills. These are about 100 centimeters by 150 centimeters or 40 by 60 inch stills, as well as some of the ephemera, the flags, is exhibited in museums and galleries. This is actually just an image of how the artwork has kind of continued beyond the artwork existing in galleries and museums. This is sort of a reunion of people who got together afterwards. It's not all 350 people, but some people who wanted to get together to talk and sort of continue this legacy in some ways, get together on various points. And this sort of, I mean, we've had some conversation today about the ephemeral nature of certain artworks. This artwork is inherently ephemeral. I mean, people could see, this 2-day reenactment, that's ephemeral. The project actually was a 7-year project with many of the reenactors recruiting people to be part of it over the course of that 7 years and figuring out how to embody freedom and emancipation during that time. And there were many conversations that were had as part of people coming to grips with that. This sort of forging of this army of the enslaved and that experience is how the project lives on. There are these performance stills, and that's important. And there's video of the project, that's important. But more important than that was we had 350 ambassadors for freedom looking at how a 19th century history and legacy of freedom and emancipation could be operative and influence people today, where people in 1811 saw that they had no way to get free except by ending the system of enslavement, which was the vision of the rebels in 1811. They weren't just trying to individually escape or form a maroon colony of a few people but still left slavery intact so they'd always be on the side. They wanted to seize all of Orleans territory and set up an African republic in the New World that would have outlawed slavery. And so that vision of what's the problem is slavery. What's the solution? End enslavement. And so that's what they were doing and is operative with the people who were talking about that in the present. So this was near the end. This was after people had marched together for 2 days. Most of the people hadn't met each other before. I mean, small groupings of people knew each other, but it wasn't as if we rehearsed this in secret and then did it. It was small groupings of people thinking about this history. And they had then forged themselves into this liberating army of the enslaved and that existed in our present. This was not scripted. This was something that the people sort of made the project their own. It was a community-engaged project. This was not my idea. This was their idea at that particular moment, and they had made the project their own. This was a liberatory project. This was both for the audience seeing it, but for the reenactors who were embodying this history. This brought this history into our present, and then how people act on that, both in terms of seeing the specific history, but how they embody, well, what does that mean to take this image and idea of freedom and emancipation into our present is what the project is about, and is how the project lives on. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Dred. And the third participant of tonight's panel is Sara Leghisa, Italian artist who operates, who works locally and also internationally. So their practice embrace performance, but also curatorship and research. So and actually, their practice is happening mainly in public spaces, exploring the variety of power dynamics within them. So the floor is yours, Sarah.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me. I wrote down what I want to say because I was very afraid to not be able to speak good English and to lost myself in time. So I'm also very inspired by all the conversation we are having today here, and thank you very much. In fact, during the afternoon, I put more line in my thing. I hope I can do it in 10 minutes. So I work as an artist, and I do a specific project in public space mostly, questioning about the dynamic of power and power self-regulation in public space, and how to raise attention on a certain aspect of reality that is already there. Today I would like to share one of my practice, that it's a wild posting practice, through it I bring outside words and voices of people, certain people and community of people that we hardly listen in mainstream media and in the public space itself because of privilege reason. The research starts several years ago through conversation with different community and micro community of people that have been invisibilized in the Western country because of gender, racism, class privilege, and even because of age. Talking about legal and illegal practice in public space. That it's also a topic that it's related to my practice working in public space, like this liminarity between legal and illegal. And as a friend and activist told me once, illegal practice has the capacity to make the power visible. And because I always have this image in my bag, I thought it was the right moment to take it outside. I would like to give this to the person that did the Monument Museum, but I don't know if you're still here. So if you are here, this is a statue in Milano that has been colored by a transfeminist movement in 2018 in order to visualize the colonial past, Italian colonial past. Indro Montanelli, statua. So I started doing action that were not authorized, and I still do. Sometimes I do authorized action, sometimes not. To do it, I was wearing an orange uniform as a device that allowed me to be mimetical in the urban landscape because it is used by street workers in public space. Paradoxically, a hyper-visible orange suit gave me the power of a kind of invisibility, and I could vehicle through this political content in my poster. During one of the first residencies in Madrid, I was working with a group of students and we were wild posting around the neighborhood, Lavapié, trying to avoid police, the police control. And then we realized that the police was only interested in controlling not white people living there. So we could posting very easily without, even without authorization because we were white. So this awareness also had a question in the while posting we were doing, and the question was, in the street, who do you watch? So privilege give us the invisibility power in public space in terms of dynamic of power. as a white person, I know I know this on my body, and I also, for example, I can have advantage by passing as a cis man sometime. So I know that I can use it in public space. Because I look like I've been perceived as a cis man often. The first work I did, it was a sort of public lecture where I was posting more or less 70 posters, one after the other, overlapping the composition for a time of around 30 minutes. The content of the research I did, it was about a practice called mimetical use of the law, and it's when people are forced to use the law to transgress the law itself because of human rights are denied to them. For example, getting married for obtaining a passport. For this reason, the lecture itself is called "Will You Marry Me?" I would like to show you the video. It's very short. That was doing just after the COVID, the lockdown. So also the topic, the content, sometimes are related to the restriction that we were experiencing that time. Thank you. So maybe I don't 5 minutes here? Okay. And so from this format, then I worked for the last 5 years, and also the work took many different formats. And I want just to share with you now another couple of work. One and it's part of a work that I call like public literature project, where I edit and compose texts starting from texts that already exist. This performance is muscle. It's an extract of a text from Katie Acker called "Against Ordinary Language: The Language of the Body." In this case, the action I do and the perception and the relation I have with my body itself, it related to the content of the text that I post. Not having a binary perception of my body, because of this I struggle with certain contests, for example, a university, where it's forbidden for me to take out my t-shirt to perform it. Another work I want to bring under your attention is Unborn Celebration that I did just recently for the Malta Biennial. I've been invited there to perform, and they asked me to work about abortion, because abortion is still not allowed in Malta. So, sorry, I can... maybe I can do it. So they invited me to do a work about abortion, and I chose to work with Simon Marsarlos. It's a friend of mine, and they wrote an amazing poem called "I Want an Abortion Every Day." So we composed the text for the action that was supposed to happen on a very large building in the center of La Valletta in Malta. They invited me, but then when they saw the text, the person on the higher power position up on the curator belonging to Malta say it was not possible to show this text in Malta. So they asked me to change the text, and we negotiate a lot. Okay. And I just want to say that in the end, the entire work was moved somewhere else. Not in the center of Malta, as you can see, but in a very distant place where people of Malta couldn't not read and enjoy it. And and the fact that I have been censorship, also because then they didn't invite the journalists to join the performance. So the censorship and pressure I received, it was very hard to face. I think art should take political position, and right now I want to say that I'm positioned against the genocide and the colonial occupation that Israel is doing against Palestine. And I'm very concerned about the unprecedented attack on international law. To conclude, I want to say it's problematic that almost all the art institutions have been critical and do program and discussion about the colonization, but no one of them is taking a public position standing for Palestine right now. So we are very struggling with this as an artist community. And I want to conclude, outside here there is a wall. You can go outside, turn left, and there is a wall where an Italian white guy represents passports, international passport as opera that he did. And in this representation he painted include the Israeli passport, but not the Palestine passport. And actually, in general, I think representing the Israeli passport is very problematic right now. Thank you.
I guess like we're four, so we can easily sit here finally and advocate for more, let's say, coherent conversation. So thank you for your presentations. Thank you for the input you made to the entire event of today. So, and I have a bunch of questions in my head, but we have natural limitations. So I would start with something that how do I see it and perceive it can put together your practices. And specifically, I'm talking about the community, about your practices that very often are related to, as already said, to the body, to the performative experience, and to the process of community building. So sometimes this community is really very precarious and doesn't have any stable forms, but sometimes, like for example in your Dread's case, so this community and thanks to this very stage, powerful theatrical situation, and also thanks to the preparations of this process. So the community is very visible, is very present. So I would like to address these questions to all of you. So how your practice is operating within this community building process. So how stable these forms are, and how, or probably like Alexandra in your case, so when you didn't plan that it will be somehow a community involving process, right, or people involving process, but then this certain commonness has arrived. So, Dred, I would suggest you to start. So.
Okay. Well, thanks. I mean, the question of communities is interesting. I mean, a lot of community-engaged artists go into an existing community and are sort of, in some ways, servants of that community. They find what the community needs or what the community thinks it needs and then do work. And I approach things a little bit differently. I think I understand questions that are important for a community that may not be physically in the same space or meeting or gathering, but that is something that is very important for a community. And so with Slave Rebellion reenactment, there was a community, but it didn't necessarily know each other and wasn't meeting and functioning as such. And through sort of posing that it would be important to reenact and embody this history of liberation, found the people for whom that mattered. And, you know, in 1811, the leader of the rebellion, a man named Charles Deland, along with other leaders, but he went from plantation to plantation because he had relative freedom of movement and recruited people who became his lieutenants. And those people, in turn, found the people on their plantations who should participate, as well as kept the information away from those who should not know about it because of potential death of people that would be participating. And that was a methodology which I reenacted as far as building this project. I mean, I went to a relative handful of people, and then they in turn recruited other people. There were one-on-one conversations. It was not like a call that went out over the internet, or in fact, people were specifically told, don't organize this online. Talk with your friends, your neighbors, and that's how it was built in conversations over dinner or over, you know, in small places, intimate settings. And through that, over the course of time, I mean, some people were working on the project for several years, other people for several months, and some people for several days. But that's how the community was forged. And you know, many people wanted there to be something, some concrete thing that came out of it, like, look, we want an organization to come out of it, including we want this community to have sort of a position on voting for the next election or something like that. And I didn't want to do that. I said, look, I want this vehicle to be able to be something where people take from it what they need and develop new relationships that are important to them. And so we were bringing students together with lawyers together with activists together with, you know, elderly community leaders. And that kind of then led to sort of an organic thing that where some people continued to meet in some ways, other people just had the idea, but it was a real community, but some of it was very much hidden from the public and some of it existed in various forms. But that was what I thought was needed for the project, and it deeply resonated with a lot of people, and some people are still in touch with each other and talking and collaborating in interesting ways.
Yeah, exactly about this, about collaborators, because I watched this video and one of the ladies is, she's telling her story and she was sewing the costumes, so she was one of those who was sewing, and it's her kind of contribution, and it makes perfect sense. Alexandra, so how about you? So you showed us like your very start as a solo artist with the community project, community-based project, and then already in New York doing the sculptures. So you didn't expect at all from people to interact and to launch, let's say, totally different dynamics around your objects. So how was it in your case?
Well, first I have to ask for apologies because 2 of the dates of the images that I showed were completely wrong. One was from 2004, and in fact it's 2016, and the other one was 2010, and it's actually 2020. Anyway, so one thing that for me is essentially to say here is the fact that it relates to my education as a young artist in Cuba, in relation to the community and how things evolve in a way. And I always have in mind the idea of community, even though perhaps I didn't plan certain things. But I have to mention that departing in the early 90s, when Cuba goes into the worst crisis ever experienced in Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, one of the first ideas that my professor René Francisco introduced us is the fact that art, in a way, can solve practical things. And in that sense, he took us to an old building in old Havana and tell us to ask to the neighbors what will make them happy. And of course, they started mentioning things that they make them happy, like a refrigerator, a washing machine, things that are needed. Obviously, we couldn't afford something like that because we didn't have that ourselves. But in turn, we told them, listen, I can paint your walls, I can build a cabinet, I can recreate a painting of whoever you love that you lost. That type of things that are practical. So in that sense, I learned that art, besides the message, it also can provide a platform for people. So in that sense, for me, to create a project in New York City, it is totally a foreign thing, thinking in terms of Cuba. But at the same time, I'm offering, again, to the city what I think the city should look at in a different way. And in that sense, it's always to provide. It's about to receive, but in turn to provide to others with a message, but also with practical things in this sense. And in the case, for instance, in the case of Orange Functional, this idea that grows from the tree that is actually on a sculpture and turns into a tree that actually functions, that actually make people to practice something, is an evolution that it totally relates to that first stages of, like, as a student, learning how to provide things to others. So in that sense, I see that as a continuum in my practice. So,
Sarah, what about you? Can you relate to this community topic, because you rather operate within this gap between being visible and invisible? So, but still, you have like what we saw when you were performing. So you, through your uniform, you kind of belong to sort of community, sort of yes, they're always visible. To the community of people who are wearing uniforms. So, and this is kind of signature. That's the signature of this group of people who, for like our everyday eye, they kind of remain invisible. Or it's like using your words. So you are operating like with the artistic system that stays where the message, the manifesto, is kind of central. So what is your...
Yeah, I would not say that I feel connected to a community that it's because of the uniform.
No, sure, just one of the...
But I use the uniform as a way, like, for being a vehicle, for being like kind of, not so, like mimetize myself somehow. And for me, with this, it's possible to be a vehicle of message and words. And I work a lot with community of people, and we write together the text. And for a long time, I just recently, like since 3 years, I'm working with students after the COVID time. And we were sharing conversation about how it was for them being locked at home and study from home during the COVID. And now it was go back to school. How important is like body, like being present in your body, and what meant for them to go back and suffer of mental health because of stress of valuation system and program, and not giving attention on body and the necessity of socializing, etc. And then all the word and sentence became a manifesto for public space, and I was working with them, posting the poster all around neighborhood and places in many cities in Italy. So, yeah.
Did you feel any kind of support from your community when this episode in Malta happened?
Actually, I was sharing this in a chat with Il Campo Innocente. It's a collective that I'm part with, and it's a collective of artists work for Laboratori dell'Arte. And we try to denounce a situation that happened in artistic field. But because it was very tricky, because they didn't pay me, they paid a part of the work, so I'm trying to tell this but not tell this, and then a journalist contacted me, and she wrote an article about this, because she was like, why no one tell me that you were doing this? And so there is the article, but I'm struggling with saying out loud because I want to be paid.
This is still inherent of contemporary artists. As far as I understand, we are running out of time dramatically, so I would leave... we have already. Okay, we have. So going back to your presentations and to a practice. Another topic that was particularly interesting for me is the presence of the body in the public space, in the urban landscape. And it's completely different, for example, in the case of Dread, of Sarah, because not only talking about the mechanics of how visible or invisible this presence is, but what was I particularly interested in is the question how the presence of the body, unlike many other interventions that we saw today in the urban space, in the urban landscape, what is the specificity of the presence of artistic body in the urban landscape? How would you formulate that? I think to all of you.
Well, I can explain that very easy, particularly with the work that I'm developing right now. Last year, I was invited to create a project in a museum in New Jersey, Art Yard. One of my ideas was to create a watercolor, a large-scale watercolor. We're talking about 25-meter long, 71 feet long, by 11, 3 meters. And the idea was to do the watercolor by taking water from the Delaware River, and all the meaning that implies that. So daily, I will go to the river to gather water or to get water with a bucket. And on my way back to the studio, people were wondering what I was doing with that water. So that allows me to start interacting with people in the basis that I explain what I'm doing, and there's not even the necessity for them then to go to the museum. So in that sense, this exchange that I create, the language of the body, whatever happened in between, I consider that as important as being at the museum as a finished object or whatever you present at the museum. So it's about that process that for me really trigger other possible situations. So in that sense, that's how I see it.
Your Dread.
So I guess there are a couple of questions around that. I mean, it's a question of the public and a question of bodies. And part of the thing of the public is, I'm a visual artist. Most of my work shows in galleries and museums. But I've consistently done a lot of work in public, sometimes with permission, sometimes without. And I value both of those audiences, the audience that will voluntarily go into a museum and the audience that doesn't really care about museums I think we all need art, and I think that the questions that I address are important for a range of communities, and so there is that aspect of the public, of reaching people that might not necessarily go to see something else, and they have it sort of coming to their space, which is great. I mean, on Slave Rebellion reenactment, there was one woman we came across who profusely thanked us for bringing this history to her community. She lived in a trailer that was not really in a trailer park, but it was on land that her family had owned for 3 generations, but it was right next to rich people's land, and she said nobody ever talks about this, and she was just so overjoyed that we had come. But beyond that is the question of Black people in this history in that space. And as Janelle had talked about, look, there's not only George Floyd, but the police kill a lot of people in America. And Hamza had talked about how there's the White League in New Orleans, and that was in the past, but that there's this whole history and legacy, including of people that don't want what they perceive as their monuments taken down or their history erased. And just to be blunt, it's racist. It's racist as hell. And where this project took place is literally Klan country. Some of the people that were reenactors asked us how we are going to safely move through these areas, because we had sort of prop guns, but that people in that area routinely walk around with Confederate flags and real automatic weapons. And so it was a real question of how can we successfully bring this area with Black and Indigenous people into a community that includes a lot of Black and Indigenous people, but also includes white supremacists that are organized and are very upset by the world changing. And so having bodies, particularly Black and Indigenous, rupturing into that space as sort of a liberating army of the enslaved was something that could rupture that space in a way that I don't think other work kind of could. It was very important that we were not just Black bodies, but that we were armed Black bodies, even if they were prop weapons. And that's one of the things in talking with the reenactors. When we were getting together to sort of practice a little bit, there was 2 things that were happening. One, we were doing de-escalation training so we could figure out how to, in this performance, exude militance but actually not be individually confronting if there were people that tried to stop the performance or alter it in some way. But the other thing is actually getting people to, as I said, sort of walk as an army. And in that, people got their costumes for the first time, but then they were handed either a machete or a sickle or a gun. And I told people, look, your costume's not complete, because people were thinking the costumes are really great, but it's not complete until you have a machete in your hand or something like that. That is part of the costume. So it is a body, but it is a body that is exemplifying and exuding something different than just a generic body, but is a specific body on a specific mission with a specific politic that is in that space in a way that it's not necessarily thought of as supposed to be, but is something that for some people was extremely welcomed and other people was challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I have something to add also, because when I was watching the video, so this very contrast of true agents, which is who are the people who are doing and who are not agents, who are almost like they were filming, they were making photographs, and this visual contrast in every single gesture, in every single attitude. It was such a powerful almost statement, and the statement was different, but this very clear visual contrast was something like really deeply present and visible. So Sarah, what about you? What are your
I always work with the body. I belong to performing art, and when I maybe also more in the other work, it's always a question I ask to myself. It's how to be perceived as a body in any space I pass through. Because I know it's political, the body, and so I always really try to pay attention to where I am. How can I be in that space, in that context? How can I relate my body and myself with people that habit that place? So I start observing and listening and try to open a relationship. but I think it's a central thing.
For your practice, yeah. So I would say that we, so probably a couple of questions, a couple of comments from our audience. If you like to comment or ask something, please feel free to do that.
Buenas tardes. I try to be clear. It's important because I'm here to understand and to know how one artist like Arachea can change his work when now he's living in another place. Because I know very well his work and I know the Carpintero's work, and this kind of work takes so much about this situation in Cuba. This problem was something really nice in this moment. You were an explosion, no? And I want to know, to know how you can available this, and how is your soul now, tu alma, tu espíritu.
My soul. Well, my soul is very fine. Well, you know, it's obviously when you immigrate, it's a big change, and perhaps I'm more boring now. But
I wouldn't say that.
But no, I mean it's a joke. But I think one of the things in relation to Cuba versus where I live now, whether it's Europe or USA, is the fact that the tools that you learn in Cuba, in this case, in order to survive, mainly in the 90s, is something that it continued with you. And I just, you know, in the new context, obviously you have to learn and you have to really study things, you know, because you get for granted when you are in your country, you know a lot of things because it's, you know, you are there. But when you are, you know, a foreigner or you are, you know, you have immigrated, then you have to learn. And that's what I've been doing. And I've been learning through my art because I exhibit my art in situations that I never expected. I never expected to exhibit at Coachella. I never expected to exhibit in Miami Beach, or I never expected to, you know, exhibit in the many places that I have done it recently. And the level of exposure that you have when you exhibit at those places is really high and demanding because you have to learn a lot about the particular situations that make those spaces possible, because you are now trying to dialogue with that and you have to do it consciously. And in that sense, for me, have been a learning curve that is really exciting, and I continue with the excitement of getting new opportunities where I can display all my you know what I want to do as an artist, you know. So.
Anyone else? Questions, comments? Or, okay.
Question for Sarah, and about her experience in Malta. So your one is not an experience of migration like the one of Alexander, but of course it was not your country, it was not your culture. So maybe my question is, did you underestimate the context there, or you assume that the same kind of censorship might have happened in Italy as well?
They invited me, asking me to do a work about abortion. And then I proposed this text, and then they told me that would that they start saying, but this is too much political, and the people here would never understand, and it will have a boomerang effect also against the people that are fighting for abortion here. So I was really like questioning about this, and I was like contacting activists in Malta pro-abortion, and they were super supportive, and they were like saying they wanted to support the thing. So then I went back to the curator saying, actually, the activists here, they are all agree to supporting the action, but then they continue saying that was not possible because in general people would not understand. And then they said it was not inclusive for Catholic people. So then I was like, I couldn't continue the conversation. I was like, should it be inclusive for fascists? I don't know. So then it was really impossible to talk. So then I did it, and I changed something, the end of the final sentence. Vabbè. Was the answer toward the... Oh, okay.
What I can't understand is how they commissioned to you a work about abortion, and how could it be inclusive?
I don't know. That was the first question I asked her.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
It's like Rick Renija, who's an artist whom we all love. If you remember one of those phrases, "Fear eats your soul," and actually, I think that was the curator's case, because the fear is much bigger as the wish to commission to an artist a work. So at this point, I would love to thank you all. Please, let's thank all.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being here till very late night, almost. And thank you for listening. Thank you.